My name is John Lloyd. I lead advocacy efforts with the Digital Public Goods Alliance. This is my colleague Amreen. She'll be introducing the DPG standard in a little bit. But essentially what we're going to do in this session, we're going to keep it relatively light. I know it's the end of a long, busy day. So we're going to start with a bit of a quiz. Everyone likes a pop quiz, right? Yeah. And we're going to address some of the common myths about open source. So just follow along as we're going through that. We're going to hear from Yodahe from Ethiopia. They're really leading in addressing a lot of the myths about open source in their own implementations. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about how the DPG standard can help with some of these myths around open source and all of that. So before we get going, just if you've got a pen and paper or want to follow along, that'd be great. If you're bold, I'd like to see some hands as well as we're going through the quiz, but let's get kicking off because we're a little bit late already. Okay, can you accurately spot fact from fiction? True or false? Open source is less secure than proprietary software. Is that true or false? That's resounding false? Who said false? Because that's true. Open doesn't mean open to threats, of course. Open means transparent, which can mean more secure as potential vulnerabilities are seen early. I will add as well that the open source licensing of DPGs means that their code base can be independently scrutinized and audited. That means it's easier to review the solution security features before adopting the technology. So well done to everybody that said false. True or false? Open source is free. Hearing a lot of false. Anybody for true? A couple of trues, okay. Unfortunately, it's false. There's always a cost. When we're talking about free and open source software, the free means freedom, not free cost. So there's always a cost when implementing a technological solution. This could involve an external vendor. Could be the developer of the DPG or open source solution may prefer to charge for the services and support to implement their solutions. A World Bank report, though, has told us that open source can be cheaper in the long term and avoid costly fees if a solution needs to change beyond what a proprietary vendor's contract specifies. So there's also no vendor leasing costs as well, and you can benefit from community development. So it's not free, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. All right, next. Open source is good for innovation. Who says true? True? Yeah, let's see some hands, great. Anybody saying false? No, great. Well, you're correct. It is, in fact, true. For example here, Google decided to release Android as an open source OS. Android being the most popular OS for mobiles in the world now. And they did that specifically so no single party was able to restrict the market and reduce innovation. Because of the influx of users to Android, Google actually developed its own smartphone, the Pixel. So, yeah, very good for innovation. Okay, so open source means there can be restrictions on how the software or solutions are used. False? Do we have any trues? Okay. That is true. Well done. So, depending on the type of license used, there are certain permissions, limitations, and conditions on how you can use those open source tools. We'll talk a little bit about licensing a little bit later in the presentation as well. Okay, we're halfway through. Anybody got 100% so far, mentally? Great, well, very well done. All right, so open source is bad for sensitive data collection. Yeah, you know it's false. In fact, MOSIP, which is why we're all here, that's proof that systems implemented nationwide can be just as safe as proprietary solutions. And in fact, because of the transparent nature of the code, bugs can be found even faster. So open source is inferior to proprietary solutions. I think you know where we're going here. Is this true or false? Yeah, false. We know that open source tools and software are created and deployed and used by all sorts of people, governments, private organizations, research and academic institutions, development organizations, nonprofits, you name it, everybody's using open source. All right, here's another one. Open source products can't make money. Is that true or false? Yeah, that one's false. One common way is that local vendors and system integrators build a service layer when open source is deployed. So in other words, they make their living from software development and maintenance. Right. So open source is effectively implemented off the shelf, so you can just use it straight away. Is that true? Can I see hands? False hands? Got some. It is indeed false. I would say the majority of the time that while the solutions are developed to be implemented to meet different country context needs, they usually do require some level of adaptation, expertise, and support to be the most effective and locally relevant. So if you're interested in finding a DPG that might be right for you as well, you can use the DPG registry, which can be found at digitalpublicgoods.net. I need to put that plug in as DPGA. Okay, this one is for me and Amreen. The DPGA Secretariat, where we work, we don't want every open source product to become a digital public good. Is that true or false? Who says true? Hands up for true? Hands up for false? Well, that's true. We don't necessarily think that every single open source product should become a digital public good. There are lots of use cases for why they wouldn't. But we think it's really important that digital public goods exist. They provide choice for countries when you're building out your foundational and sectoral DPI to help vendor lock-in and maintain sovereignty over your own system. And of course, it helps meet needs and address challenges of attainment of the SDGs, particularly for resource-strained countries. And then finally, all open source products are digital public goods. Yeah, that's a resounding false. Who said false? Because that's true. So not every open source product is compliant with the DPG standard. Amreen is going to talk a bit about the standard very soon, but essentially it establishes baseline requirements that must be met in order to earn recognition as a DPG. They must meet every single one of the 9 key indicators, which Amreen will cover later in this presentation. But before we get there, essentially, was anything surprising for anybody here? Is there anything you're still in doubt about? If you are, you can come and have a chat to me or Amreen after the session. By the way, after the session, if you would like a snazzy Digital Public Goods Alliance sticker or a 50 and 5 sticker, there's some down here at the front of the stage. And without further ado, I'm going to call up Yodahead to the stage and come and have a quick chat about how you would address misconceptions of open source.
I thought it was going to be more conversational. So myth-busting open source, right? That's today's session. John has already myth-busted everything. There were some gray areas for me in there as well, as about true or false, not 100% sure. It was a very interesting presentation. So the number one question that John presented is it inherently insecure? And that's always the question that we get asked, especially when we tell policymakers in Ethiopia that we're going to put the most sensitive data, which is fingerprints and biometrics, things that people cannot effectively replace. We're going to put it in an open source platform developed in India. Everybody says, are you sure? So the number one question is, when something is open source, obviously there is more eyes on it, not just one developer or two developers that just publish it. It takes certain level of confidence in the quality of code, the quality of software that you develop to be able to put it online so that everyone else can critique it. So obviously, I personally believe it's inherently more secure, and that's a kind of myth that we typically have to bust whenever we talk about open source. The other one is for countries that essentially finds itself cash-strapped, such as ours. We cannot be spending millions of dollars paying premium software companies globally. It obviously makes a lot more sense. As it's been said before, open source is not free, but in most cases it's cheaper than proprietary solutions. So that's another rationale that we use to justify. And the third one is vendor lock-in. Vendors are important. You cannot keep reinventing the wheel. You have to be dependent on others, whether you're using proprietary blocks or open source blocks. You're going to have to reuse something at the end of the day. But vendor lock-in, it's everybody, when we talk about vendor lock-in, it may be common to think about like some big multinational global company coming in and locking you out of your data. Most of the time, the vendor lock-in doesn't necessarily come from some big corporation, right? It could be a badly designed small ecosystem. It could be a local player that locks you out. It doesn't have to be an international vendor. So how you design your project is important to avoid vendor lock-in, and one way to ensure that, obviously, is to rely on open source. So these are the three myths that I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
That's one. Thanks, Yodahe. I think that's a really valid point as well about vendor lock-in. It isn't necessarily the big players that are locking you in. It could be a smaller local vendor as well. So, very, very good point. So why does open source even matter? Essentially, open source is about having the source code data or content available under a license that allows you to use, reuse, and redistribute a solution. So here's some examples. I mentioned Android earlier on. Firefox is another really well-known one, run by the Mozilla Foundation, and of course, OpenOffice, LibreOffice. And then you can't really see the logos. They haven't shown up very well here, but there are hundreds or thousands of open source products and services. And without us really knowing it, we rely on open source every day in our digital lives. From the web browser, like we could be using Firefox, but most services run what we call like the cloud. Even all of the apps we have on our phones, they heavily rely on open source libraries, programming languages and standards, even if they aren't necessarily calling themselves open source, but pretty much every single organization, company, and government benefits from open source. And really, not all open source is made the same. And that's why we want to focus a little bit on DPGs and how they're different. But essentially, you'll notice here the demand side for open source software is nearly $9 trillion US. It's nothing to sneeze at whatsoever. And they estimate that companies are going to have to spend 3.5 times more if open source didn't exist. So without further ado, we're going to talk about how we maintain the integrity of open source through digital public goods and the DPG standard. So for that, I'll call up my colleague, Amreen.
Okay, so thanks very much, John, for giving me the floor. Hi, everyone. I am Amreen Taneja. I am the standards lead at DPGA, wherein I oversee the management, the development, as well as the promotion of the DPG standard. And today I would like to share about what we at the DPGA do to sort of prevent this issue of open washing or open source washing, and how the DPG standard, in fact, plays a critical role in defining what digital public goods are, and how it lays down a very robust criteria for recognizing an application as a digital public good. So I'll begin with the definition of what is a DPG, right? So the DPGA defines digital public goods to be open source software, open standards, open data, open content, or open AI systems that adhere to privacy and other applicable laws and best practices. They do no harm, and they help attain the sustainable development goals, right? So this DPG definition, in fact, was laid out by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the Secretariat operationalizes this DPG definition through the standard. So the DPG standard is an open and a transparent standard, and it revolves around these three principles. So first is that DPGs have to advance sustainable development goals. Second, they have to be built using open source technology. So what that means is that the code needs to be accessible and it needs to be transferable, right? And thirdly, it must not do any harm by design. I'll be speaking a bit more in detail about this particular indicator. It is indeed a very interesting one. And there are a set of 9 indicators that are basically used to determine whether or not an application can qualify as a DPG. So the DPG standard actually comes to life through these 9 indicators that you see here on the screen. And this elaborates basically on what do no harm by design means for privacy, for security, and also adherence to laws, applicable laws, as well as best practices. And these indicators, they create a baseline of requirements for earning recognition as a DPG. And one of the core functions of the Alliance is actually to steward this definition and maintain the standard as well as its application. So now I would like to talk a little bit more about, why is the DPG standard needed? Why is it so important? So firstly, as you can see, it establishes a clear definition for what qualifies as a digital public good, right? And right now in this rapidly evolving digital landscape, having a standardized framework, that really ensures consistency and it ensures clarity in identifying DPGs themselves. Secondly, it promotes public good. That is no surprise. It is there in the term itself. So the standard basically requires applications to be in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. And this ensures that, whatever the digital initiatives actually are that get accredited as DPGs, they positively contribute towards global development objectives. Thirdly, one of the key principles that are embedded within the DPG standard is the do no harm principle, right? So this is very critical because it sort of requires DPGs to be designed with ethical considerations in mind. So from the outset, we maintain this principle as key to the integrity of a DPG in itself. Fourthly, it combats open source washing, or open washing as we call it. So, the standard basically does this by providing clarity on what are the licenses that are actually required for an application to become a digital public good. And this sort of prevents the misleading claims, first of all, that are there around DPGs. And also, it ensures that the projects truly adhere to the principles of openness as well as accessibility, both of which are very, very important. Lastly, the standard maximizes consensus on whether a project conforms to the definition of a DPG that has been laid out by the UN Secretary General, right? And thereby, it naturally enhances credibility and trustworthiness of the concept of DPG in itself. So, now I will talk about each indicator of the standard a bit more in detail to give you a better idea of what the DPG standard actually entails. And if time permits, I'll also provide some examples of, in terms of the exceptional responses that we have received from some of the DPGs that are there in the registry, just to give you an idea of, the robustness of the answers we expect from applicants for every indicator. So the first indicator is SDG relevance, right? So basically, if an open source application does any sort of good for the society, it tends to fall under one SDG or the other, right? So what we look for here is, whether there is a clear contribution to either one or more SDGs. And, the examples can be many, but just to give you a few, it could be, universal access to healthcare services, or it could be contribution towards research on vaccinations or medications. The list is long. So the applicants are essentially provided, are required to provide us a statement explaining how their application seeks to contribute to this particular SDG. And we, in fact, also have an SDG tool tracker on our website that delineates the various DPGs that we have on the basis of the SDGs that they seek to contribute towards. Now, indicator number 2, this talks about open licensing, which John was mentioning about earlier. So I'm sure many of you already know this, but open licenses are essentially any type of license that grants certain permissions to users regarding the use, the modification, and the distribution of a piece of content or software, right? So essentially, open licenses, they promote collaboration, they promote innovation, and they promote the free exchange of ideas, right? So they remove many of the restrictions that were associated with the traditional IP laws, whether it was copyright or patent and many others, right? So in this case, the DPG standard also has a specific list of open licenses that we accept. So just to give you a couple of examples, so all licenses that are approved by OSI, the Open Source Initiative for Software, are accepted by us. Then Creative Commons licenses are accepted by us for open content. Then Open Knowledge Foundation licenses are accepted by us for open data. So as you can see on the screen, these are some of the freedoms that a user can actually enjoy while using open licenses, right? So this means they have the freedom to run or access the application. They have the freedom to study without discrimination. They have the freedom to redistribute that particular application. And they also have the freedom to distribute modifications. So this is a wide array of freedoms that users are provided, which are not there in proprietary formats, of course. And yes, with that, we move on to indicator number 3. So this talks about clear ownership, right? So we have this indicator, because we want to make sure that there is some amount of sustainability in an open source solution, right? So this also ensures that there is someone who is maintaining the application, who is responsible for that application, and it is not just a product, that will stay sort of stale in the registry, right? So, and this ownership can look like, it can be as simple as individuals owning the copyright of code, or it could be larger organizations having some sort of a governance model or a contribution model, or rather, it can also be open communities that develop the solution. So we accept all these kinds of, ownership positions. And in fact, for this indicator, we basically expect applicants to provide us clear links to a website or to a publicly available document that clearly states the relation between that stated legal entity and the solution itself, right? And just to give you an example, so AgroWork Multilingual Thesaurus that is run by FAO, they have done a very good job at this, right? They have actually demonstrated the link between the solution and the product owner, which is FAO, through their website. And that is the clarity that we expect from all sorts of applicants who are there, who are applying through the DPG standard to become a DPG. Now, moving on to platform independence. This is indicator number 4. And this is a very, very important indicator, because essentially it ensures that adopters and implementers of a DPG, they have the option to choose whatever works best for them, right, without any mandatory dependencies coming in the way. So this basically means that, we as the DPGA, we would like for everything to be open source as a part of your application. But if, for example, you have a proprietary component, within your solution, and you apply to become a DPG, so if you provide us an open source alternative alongside your application, we would accept that. That would be okay. But the main condition for this is actually going to be whether, the fact that it should be easy for implementers to sort of implement this alternate solution seamlessly and independently, most importantly. Because the whole idea behind this is for vendor lock-in to be avoided. That is one of the main goals behind this particular indicator. So in this case, Form, which is also a DPG, they did a great job in sort of providing us a response for this indicator because they provided a clear and clear set of practical instructions essentially, which were not just theoretical in nature. This was actually tried and tested. So on how we can swap out the closed components with the open ones without sort of compromising the core offering of the solution. So that being the key. Now moving on to documentation, this is a fairly straightforward indicator as the name suggests, right? But I'll just talk about what this means for the different kind of applications that we receive. So supposing for software solutions, this would actually be technical documentation which would allow a technical person unfamiliar with the project to sort of launch and run the software independently, right? In case of content collections, the applicant needs to include everything that is actually needed to access that piece of content. So that could be applications, it could be software, it could be hardware, along with explicit instructions on how to use that data, right? Then in case of open data, you have to provide documentation explaining every part of the data set. You have to include what each sort of field means, how that data was collected, so people can understand and use it properly. So that is the level of detail we expect when an applicant actually applies to become a DPG. Now moving on to indicator number 6. So this is the mechanism for extracting data, right? So what this means essentially is that if your product collects any type of non-PII data, then it should be possible to access that through a non-proprietary format, right? So just to give you an example, we have a lot of climate-related DPGs in our DPG registry. So if, let's say, a government tomorrow wants to implement one of those DPGs in their own country, they should be able to access that data and migrate it through an open format, right? So they should be having either a provision to download that data through a CSV format, or they should be given access through an open API, or basically any mechanism for you to do that. Now, moving forward to indicator number 7, this actually talks about privacy and applicable laws, right? So this indicator, it requires complying to any laws that might apply to your technical solution. Basically, it could be privacy laws within your jurisdiction or even in the jurisdiction where you plan on operating or deploying that product. So let's say if you plan on deploying a solution in Europe, your solution needs to be GDPR compliant, right? And what we expect from applicants is also to provide us proof of compliance. And what that proof can look like is either it can be in the form of a terms of use or it can be in the form of a privacy policy. And in fact, we are actually working on fine-tuning this critical indicator right now. And we've instituted an expert group of external subject matter experts who are all privacy professionals from various jurisdictions as well as various industries. So we have technical experts, legal experts, people from academia, as well as industry and business experts who are working with the DPGA to actually, as a neutral group of SMEs, to make this indicator even more robust. Now I'll talk about indicator number 8. So this is standards and best practices, right? So this indicator has been designed and developed sort of to align with the relevant standards, best practices, and principles that are there. So simply speaking, any standard or best practice that applies to the industry in which your solution belongs, you should adhere to them. That is what it means. So for example, any standards by W3C, it could be the GDFS for public transport, it could be open contracting standard for fiscal transparency. And there are many such examples, and some of them are also here on the screen for your reference. And lastly, I'll move on to indicator number 9, which is do no harm by design, right? So here we say by design because we don't look at implications down the line that might be completely out of your control, right? So we understand that in open source, your project can be used for various use cases, right? And so that is the very reason we don't look at how the project is going to be used, but we look at how it is actually being built. That is what we focus on. And as a part of this, we look at three main things. So first is that you need to have a privacy policy. Second, and very importantly, how you handle PII data when there are security concerns, right? And thirdly, if there is a mechanism, in fact, to prevent harassment and also illegal content within the product, right? So for example, do you have a code of conduct, or do you have some sort of moderation features within your product? So those are some of the considerations that we look at. And the idea behind the last one is actually that the product owners must think of all the risks that are there and also the process on how to mitigate them. And we want them to document this as a part of the application process. So yes, these are actually the 9 indicators that make the DPG standard, and they set the criteria for an application to become recognized as a DPG. And now I think you can understand better how the DPG standard in fact plays a critical role in preventing this open source washing challenge that we are facing nowadays. And also it makes sure that the DPG users and the stakeholders that are having access to this application, they are truly accessible and open for all, right? So that is our main focus. So yes, these are essentially some of the resources which you all can access based on the the presentation that we gave today. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments regarding the presentation today, I would invite you all to please come on over to us and have a chat. And lastly, I would also like to thank Yodahe for sharing the exceptional experience of Ethiopia in combating these challenges around open source. And thank you to everyone present here for being an excellent audience. Thank you so much. And I'll also call John over for a final vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. We really wanted to make sure that we're addressing some of the myths, introducing the standard, and I will say MOSIP is a DPG, and really proudly so. And that means that they've met all these 9 indicators, they're under review every year, they're consistently meeting them, and that means that, yeah, there's definitely a high degree of trust that you can have in any product in the DPG registry. So thank you so much. Thanks for bearing with us as we went a little over time. We started late too, and yeah, you've been great.